Now on to the interview. I want to introduce Manny Chirico of PVH. Manny grew up just a few miles away in the Bronx. He grew up in a devout family, attended a local parish grammar school and a Catholic high school. He became interested in the business world in high school, I think you told me, and pursued a career in accounting, attending Fordham and receiving his degree, and then went into the public accounting world working for Ernst & Young. Stayed at Ernst & Young for 15 years, becoming a partner, and eventually running their retail and apparel practice. He then joined PVH as corporate controller, moved to CFO, then president and COO, and then became CEO in 2006 and chairman in 2007. He's a 2016 CR Magazine Responsible CEO of the Year finalist. I can also confirm he's probably wearing Calvin Klein today, as clothes are very, very important to Manny. That's a very nice suit. Yeah. Do you get? Yeah. So do you get like an employee discount or anything? Oh, yes, I do. You do? Because I'm a customer. So I was wondering, can you bust me out a discount thing? See, I get no respect. All right. Please join me in welcoming Manny Chirico to the 2016 Summit. All right, let's talk about Manny as a young person. So you grew up in a very different era. For example, when you were a kid, the Jets had Joe Namath, and they were actually good. I mean, that was, That's right. They got Ryan Fitzpatrick. Well, never mind. So a lot's changed. All right, so throughout your career, you've been involved in social responsibility in some way or another. You and I have talked about this part of the process of doing the cover story. So what influences did you have growing up in the Bronx that made giving back so important to you personally?
So listen, I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s in the Bronx, true New Yorker through and through, born and raised, educated, Catholic education. If you lived in New York, the way you identified yourself back then in neighborhoods is you would say whatever parish you were from, that would describe the geographic area, St. Anthony, St. Francis, wherever you came from. So with that background, and that took me all the way through high school and then Jesuit Catholic education at Fordham, I think it built into me an understanding that you lived your faith not just by going to Mass once a week on Sunday, you lived your faith every day. And what was drilled into, especially at the time, was, just to share, was Vatican II. There was a whole revolution going on in the Catholic Church. Social justice was critical. And that's what you were trained. It wasn't just dogma. It was, how are you going to give back? It was constantly quoted to us back in grammar school, who much is given, much is expected. And I've always tried to live by that. My family, my parents really felt that was critical. So with that kind of a background, it just kind of happened.
Well, you've always been actively involved in philanthropic programs, and one of the things, it's one thing to give money, and that's laudable, and we respect folks who are willing to give, but also you've given a lot of time, which, there was one story that you talked about actually getting involved in, I think it may have been when you were in Y, mentorship programs, and I would assume as a practice leader it was sort of a part-time job, so you had a lot of extra time on your hands to do stuff, right? With that crazy busy lifestyle. But you actually were actively involved in some mentorship programs. So I was wondering if you would share some of what you told me with our audience.
Yeah, I guess I would just to say it is, when coming out of school and I heard the conversation about millenniums and how critical it was to give back to the community. I grew up in a different era, a different society. Baby boomers, it was all about getting ahead. I mean, there's just a different mindset as kids came out of school. We got to be successful, got to drive. So those first 7-8 years of work, it was really like a total focus on, just doing well at work and whatever. And then as I got involved somewhat into, entry-level management, it was the opportunity to give back in this metric. So there was a program called Student Sponsorship. It's a New York program where the individual would mentor junior high school kids just before they were going into high school. And the idea was to get inner city kids that were economically deprived in really tough areas, South Bronx, Harlem at the time. Harlem back then was Harlem. It wasn't what it is today, gentrified and a cool place to be. Harlem was a war zone when you went through it, and you took your life in your hand if you were there 8 o'clock at night. And I got involved in this program where the idea was you would mentor this potential student as he went through, or she went through, and you would pay their tuition to go to a private school, get them out of some of these really tough areas and expose them to life as it was. And that was really my first program. And I met this young Puerto Rican kid, single parent, mother, family, economically really in a difficult situation, 117th Street, 2nd Avenue in the heart of Harlem. First time I went to meet him was to take him to a Knick game. I had to walk into the apartment building. There was drugs, there was everything. I'm saying, how does this kid live in this environment, whatever? And I was able to get involved. He went on to Cardinal Hayes High School, really got focused on doing well in not only in schoolwork, but also giving back to the community. From there, graduated, went to Holy Cross. From there, graduated, went to Fordham Law. Today, he's 42 years old, 3 kids, and he's a partner in a law firm in New Jersey. So it's just, that was my first exposure, was hands-on, and it really was a lesson to me. I got as much out of it, if not more, than he got out of it at that time.
That's true. What was the kind of advice you would give to a young man coming out of that kind of environment that you think really impacted his view of the world? I mean, it sounds like he's been a tremendous.
Well, I think the first thing, I guess one of the things, you get this program, which was really good, they gave you a little bit of training and understanding about, and I guess the one thing I learned is don't give too much advice. You know, just presence is more important. Just be there. You could be sure that someone that's growing up in that environment is going to have to deal with issues. And then those issues come up, and then you try to help them deal with those issues, as opposed to just trying to sit there and pontificate. And what I learned early on was, you know, you're coming from a situation, having some success in business, moving out of the Bronx and being able to move to Yonkers, which was a big thing at the time for us as a family. That was like, moving on up. But for him, he was just trying to get through the day. And all I tried to do is expose him, most of all, to the possibilities. What's possible? If you get a good education, this is possible. If you work hard, this is possible. And then, you deal with the crises that come up. That all sounds great, but I don't have the $1,000 that I need to pay this quarter's tuition. And then you try to help and deal with some of those situations that in real life just get in the way of trying to just move forward.
Well, that's a great example of both voluntarism and the success it can breed in society as a whole. Let's move over a little bit more to the business side. So you're a former auditor, and you've seen how businesses can get either real or get wrong. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how do you manage inside your organization to ensure that the programs that you guys institute get real and really, become important to the company culture, from your executive team down to your hourly workforce to the contract factory houses that you guys utilize as part of the supply chain? How do you make sure that things get real?
Okay, so big headline is, you have to make it part of the business process, the business strategy. It has to be built in to how you do business. I think, for me, one of the big lessons was early on when I went from Ernst & Young to PVH. The apparel industry, now we're going back to the early 90s, one of the big issues we were constantly dealing with as outsourcing was moving to Asia, Bangladesh, China, Vietnam, really tough areas that you're trying to economically improve the area, but at the same time, let's be real, we're there because it's cheap to make product there. And what we were dealing with was the outflow of that. And we had all these commitments, and we had all these regulations and rules and codes of conduct, and it was communicated to our vendor partners. but it wasn't built into the upfront process at the time. So I'm sitting there, similar to an audit. If you go in and you're planning for your year-end audit, and all you do is show up on December 31st and audit, is the balance sheet right, is the income statement right, you kind of get what you deserve. So there's problems. What the aha moment for me is why aren't we dealing with these issues up front? As we go into factories, yeah, we tell them there's a code of conduct, but why don't we really tell them what they need to do, how they need to improve, and how they need to move forward? And you'll know right away as you go through that assessment process, and that's what we built in. We built an assessment process. Before we could sign up any vendor or any factory, they had to go through this process, and we had to make a determination that they were two things, that it was factored, it was doing things in an appropriate way, and they had the right spirit if everything wasn't perfect, which it never is, that they were willing to move and improve. So we built it into the upfront process. Before that, it was all like checking at the end, having an audit of the facility every 12 months, and you'd go in there and you'd find problems, and you'd give them a report card, go fix this, and then you show up 12 months later with another report card. It just wasn't getting through. So I would say first, it just has to be built into the culture and into the business process. Second, it needs to be constantly communicated that it's critical and important and not just words. I mean, if it's just a PR story and there is an importance to that, then it's not going to be successful. It has to be built into this is how we do business. And when there is a problem, holding people accountable for the problem. Not just, let's keep the factory going, let's get the production out of that factory, and then we'll just move out. No, we've got to fix the situation in the product, in the factory, as long as the factory and the vendor has got the intention to move it forward. So you've got to be willing to work through the difficult times and make the changes. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is it's got to be built into your reward system, compensation or whatever. It's got to be a factor, because the way to get people's attention is to hit them in their pocket. And an understanding, if this is a problem, you might have delivered your annual results, you might have hit all your financial statistics, but if this is a problem, your bonus is going to be impacted by this in some way, and if it's positive, it's going to be rewarded in a positive way. So those are, for me, the key issues that had to be built in.
Now, you also have made a significant investment in CR as an executive discipline as well, where some other companies have veered away from that. So give some sense of the scope and size of the team that you're operating.
We got about 15 of our CR people here today. I see everybody out there. I guess, you know.
If you're on the PVH CR team, stand up.
All right. So I would say we've got about, I'd say globally, maybe 75 dedicated team members throughout the company. But that really doesn't measure it, because people in their roles throughout the company, in each of the divisions, there's a built-in function that a part of their job is dealing with this. If you're part of your job is to secure product around the world, and we source product out of 32 different countries, costs that range to about $4.5 billion of cost, plus our partners, our licensing partners, that's probably another $3 billion of goods. And everyone, if you're representing our brands, Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, Van Heusen, Izod, Speedo, whatever our brands, you've got to conduct business in this fashion, and we hold people accountable to it. So there's everyone in some way, shape, or form in their job is being touched by that. Just too important to how we conduct business and how we deliver it. I guess the other thing that we try to do is, I talked about communicating, but there's two sides to that. There's communicating what we do and some of the positive outcomes we have, but there's also, there needs to be an understanding that this only works if we're financially successful. So, we talk about corporate responsibility. It starts with the corporation. The corporation needs to be financially successful. It needs to deliver its results. And if you're not financially successful, if you're not delivering appropriate returns, then it's great that you're trying to save the world, but it's not about let's all build a campfire, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya at night. It's really, you have to have an understanding that there's a reason we're in Bangladesh with 22% of our production. The reason is it's very economically advantageous to make goods in Bangladesh. That's the first thing. Now, can we have a positive impact on society? Can we move a country that 10 to 12 years ago couldn't feed itself and today has become an economic force in the world? Yes. Can we do the same thing in Africa, which we're trying to do, Ethiopia, Kenya, in Egypt? Can we do this? Can business have a positive impact? Yes. But there has to be a rational business reason to be there that you can point to and then conduct business in an appropriate way that moves that society forward. And also with an understanding that Ethiopia is not New York City. It's not going to have the same developed democratic society that we have, but can we continue to make it and make it improve? And that doesn't mean you should be in places that are abusing people. People need to be held accountable, but you also need to understand, and if you go back to the early 1900s, in New York there was a major fire, Triangle Shirt Factory. The conditions working in the United States in factories where apparel were made were atrocious. That tragedy where hundreds of people lost their life, that was the event that was the catalyst to get change going in the United States. Better conditions, unionization of the workforce, and really putting the worker forward and delivering better economic and safety conditions for workers. So it just wasn't that long ago we were dealing with some of the same issues. So that understanding needs to be there.
So let's get a little more controversial for a moment. During one of the recent presidential debates.
Here we go.
Here we go. Right, tonight, for those of you who know, the third presidential debate anyway, so I'm going to get off the political humor. That's just going to get me fired. But during the presidential debate, one of the questions came up about cultural bias. Now, the interesting thing is when I saw it on the debate, the last time I'd heard that phrase before the debate itself was when we had met for the article in CR Magazine. So I'm not asking a political question, but can you describe the experience that you had at PVH with training on culture? And I need the audience to help me here. All right, Manny's going to do this without using a sports analogy. So go ahead, Manny.
So okay, so just a quick background, PVH, 65% of our workforce is female. Just under 50% of our vice presidents and directors are females. So we have a large contingent of females in our workforce. And
so that's it's being starting lineup and the back of the bench. All right, good. I just want to make that.
And it's being run by this white male. And I guess his white male happens to love sports and grew up playing sports, high school, college, and then continues and describes everything in life with a sports analogy. Everything is, the team has got to move forward and we got to score and that's delivering results for the quarter. And it's built in, and I never gave it a second thought. And someone mentioned to me that they were uncomfortable with all the sports analogies all the time because everybody and all the guys got it. And if you wanted to hang out with Manny, the best thing to do is go up and talk about what the Mets did last night or what the Jets did on Sunday, and you could really strike up a conversation. But if you had no interest in sports, what the hell am I going to talk to Manny about? Because he's not that bright and he doesn't have that many interests. So So somebody confronted me with this, and my reaction, we're not being taped, right, was, what bull. And I said,
we are being taped.
But okay, you'll bleep it. And I said, how could that be? And you start to talk to me, and I recognized two things were happening because of it. One was I was making it so much easier for a lot of people to feel more included, and people who didn't have this natural love of sports just felt constantly left out, and all the inside jokes and all the what happened on the weekend and who I might play golf with on the weekend, it was all connected. And I recognized that my actions not only was how I was conducting myself, but it was somewhat permeating the organization. So about 24 months ago, we went on and I got it. So I did research and did some work. We put a program together to talk about unconscious biases that exist. And for the whole organization, for me particularly, and most importantly, the more senior you were at PVH, the more this course, this education that we were getting was like a bright light moment for just about everybody. I mean, people come back and say it's changed the way they've looked at things. It just, we're all human beings with all built-in biases or built-in feelings, and you can't help but mirror those at certain times. And what we found is the best thing we could do is really educate people about it. So we started to really focus on diversity and inclusion. The business rationale, as we started, I remember presenting to the board and presenting that we were going to make this major investment in this part of our training development was listen, we're 65% female. We need to move them into the executive ranks and up through the glass ceiling. If we're getting just our executive group from 35% of our population, that's a problem. We could look at our statistics and feel really good that we're way ahead industry in general, but to be fair, we're already starting with 65% of workforce being female, so we're not getting that all the way through the organization. What are we doing? And that's a huge issue, but one of the areas that we decided to really focus on is diversity and inclusion. And one of the best things we did was this training. Every vice president in the company went through this training program, which was basically a day program that you went through. It was a self-assessment. It was part, and what was made it successful, I think, is we didn't just make it like one of these, flavor of the month. This is what the Manny woke up yesterday and decided was going to be important for this year, and then it'll drop off. We made it part of everybody's development effort. If you were going to be a manager, this is something you really needed to be attuned to because you're impacting people. And as you work through the organization, you have to recognize that. So as part of our training, there's a whole diversity and inclusion program. We have a diversity and inclusion council at PVH, and we've got it totally tied into our development for our executives, and I think that's why it's worked so well. It's one of the things I'm probably most proud of.
Yeah, I just had to mention the audience. The audiences look different from the stage than they do from the floor, okay? It's really important and I do a lot of public speaking, so when you mentioned unconscious bias, all the women started going like this, and all the men started going like this. Okay, so I feel kind of guilty.
Yeah, it's just true. I remember I was in a conference room with our senior male executives, explaining what we were going to try to do, and I'm talking about our senior, and it didn't start off so well. Everybody was in denial. But the best thing we did was we put that senior group through the training first, and it was just like light bulbs were just going off as people just were recognizing themselves in these exercises and seeing, nobody is trying to hold anybody back intentionally. Nobody's trying to, not include people, and nobody is that upfront, but the way you act, the way you conduct yourself, the way you conduct meetings and that you have with your teams have an impact. So it's been a real learning for us.
All right, so let's talk about one other learning. So one of the initiatives you tried was to reduce packaging waste. I found this to be an interesting example as well. You were trying to reduce the amount of material, and everyone in this room has drunk the Kool-Aid, right? This is a group that is very concerned about environment and sustainability, okay? So you tried to do this, but you found the customers it was difficult for the customers to absorb. So why don't you explain what it is that you tried to do and how you had to sort of adapt to the customer taste? Because I think there's
an important when we say consumers for us also means like department stores, Macy's, that's a customer. So just to keep it, consumers we're really talking about. So look, the first step, the fashion industry, just think about it. Why should this white dress shirt that is of high quality, made in a great factory, wrinkle-free, great products, if That same, very, very, very similar product is in Calvin Klein. It's $79.50, and if it's in Van Heusen, it's $24.99. You know, we could talk about the make. There's more stitch, but fundamentally, there's not $50 of value there. So, the fashion industry is my French answer, it's a bullshit industry. You're creating dreams. So it's a
that camera.
So packaging, marketing is so critical. So now, if the men maybe will understand this just a little bit better, but I think the women, since they usually buy 70% of what men wear, will understand it. So if you go into a dress shirt department, you see dress shirts, they're like lined up in plastic packaging with 25 pins that are holding it, tissue paper and cardboard to make it look as firm and stiff as if it just came out of the cleaners, perfect, folded perfectly. That's what you want to buy. Now, 99.9% of men do not try dress shirts on. They know their size. I'm a 16.5 neck, 35 sleeve. I know my size. You just buy it. You see colors. You see. So we said, this packaging is a disaster. Somebody, this started years ago. The packaging is a disaster. It's got plastic. It's got cardboard. It's got pins. The pins go to that. It's just a mess. So we took this packaging, and some genius in the Far East, some scientists had this idea. We'll do it. Here's the cardboard. It's very little. It looked fine in the factory. It was all packaged together. Put it in a box. What happens? You throw it in a box, and then it gets thrown into a container, goes through 8 weeks on the water, railroads, getting to your factories. Then they're picking and packing. Once it gets to the floor, this stuff looked terrible when it hit the floor. Everything was bent and whatever. That was a beautiful dress shirt, except it didn't look like it. So nothing sold. So the consumer really voted to say, I'm not buying. We had all the marketing above it saying, perfectly, environmental, everything was environmentally friendly. No pins, no. So we had to approach it so there was a real pushback from the consumer. And we were smart enough to do this with one brand and one test, as opposed to, and the learnings that came out of it is, we took it back, again, recycled packaging. We were able to come up with, instead of non-recyclable pins that recycle, but also instead of 25, now we use 8, and really take the waste significantly out. I could tell you millions of dollars that we saved from a cost point of view, which was a great benefit, and that now this plastic that used to just sit in dumps dissolves now over time. So the consumer initially pulled back, but it turned out to be a great exercise and a great learning experience. You want to do the right thing, but you've got to recognize, like when I go back, is you've also got to deliver what the consumer wants at the end of the day and how they want it.
All right, so one more question before we sort of go to the floor to see what other folks have, and I have some others in here if we don't get a lot from the floor, but I think we will. One of the things I like about Manny was his candor, and if you think about the aspect of what we just discussed, is basically you can try to do the best that you can possibly do, and that may or may not be palatable to the consumers. All right, as corporations, you still have an obligation to the shareholders to run a good business. So sometimes the goal shouldn't be, we don't want good to be the enemy or perfect to be the enemy of good. Sometimes and I'll tell you this as the publisher of the magazine, a lot of the stories I hear are just, focus on doing better tomorrow than you did yesterday. If you keep getting better, that sometimes is good enough. And that's really where we want to be headed in the right direction. So this audience, we have, some C-suite folks here. And we have a lot of other folks who are actually the leaders of corporate responsibility at their companies. For the benefit of those folks, what's your advice about the best ways to engage their CEOs in the dialogue and priorities around corporate responsibility issues? I'm going to ask you, then I'm going to ask your team if you're both. Okay?
Okay. I think if you want to convince your CEO to be more committed to this, if I understand the question, I I think you've got to build a business case. It can't just be we're doing this to be good. And there's it needs to resonate in the organization, and it doesn't necessarily need to say it's going to deliver X more dollars in profits, but in a lot of cases it's how do we defend our reputation and position. Besides our people, our most valuable assets are our brands. So for me, defending those brands every day and making sure, the one instance where you would have a problem when, if somebody wants to start a campaign because they find out that we made goods in a factory that polluted a river in China and we didn't know that there's this filtration system and there's a pipe that looks like it goes to the filtration system, but they have another pipe that just goes into the river, and it's a lot cheaper to just go into the river. Sometimes we're asking our people to be engineers to go in there and make sure that this is happening. When we show up, the filtration system is working. But that happens when you're with the wrong business partner. So I guess I'm saying is you got to build a case. I can't tell you what the case is for each of your individual businesses, but there is definitely a case, the connection with the community, defending your brands, and depending if you're in the minerals area, protecting the environment, whatever those issues are. And then I just would say is, and it was touched on at the end of when I walked into the meeting before talking about millennials, but I think that's a little bit of a cop-out. Your employees, your associates, they want to work at a place that they could really be proud of. At the end of the day, everybody, if you're talented, you can get a job. If you could do really well. But I think fundamentally people want to feel good about where they go to work. They want a balance in their life, but also understand that we've got to work hard in order to win, another sports analogy. But the key also is that they want to feel like they're working for a company that is a good corporate citizen, that's giving back. We see it, we measure it constantly. We see it in our retention, our turnover statistics, our exit interviews when we do lose people, which we do to competitors for reasonable reasons. People, and our employee surveys that we do every 18 months, people feel proud to work at PVH. It's one of the things I'm most proud of. And we try to really, really enforce that. And there's a business case to be delivered about that. I don't care what industry you're in, your people are your most important assets, and your brand is probably your second most important asset.
All right. So we have some time left. If people have questions, let's see. We have someone right over here. Can we wait for the microphone because we are taping?
Good morning. We've heard a lot about the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I'm interested to understand how PVH is making your commitment to that. Are you picking specific goals? Are you looking at it on a broad basis perspective?
I think the way we've really chose to go after that was we've looked at the goals overall, and we've decided by brand and by region what really made the most sense for everyone to go after. And we've tried to really develop it on a case-by-case basis that way. And as you roll that up, given our size and our portfolio of brands, we're really touching every one of those principles as we go forward. So that's how we've chosen to go after it. I think it's great. It's really good. It's put a framework out there. The accountability portion of that's just not there yet. Now, and that's the way most of these things start. So first thing is to get a framework. Second thing is to try to build some kind of transparency into it. And then the third thing is to try to get some kind of accountability that everybody can follow through it. We're somewhere between 1 and 2, I think, globally. I'm not talking PVH specific, but I'm talking industry-wide with those principles.
All right, before we go to the next question, for those of you who attended the premiere showing of Generation Startup last night, one of the stars of the movie, Labib Rahman, who I mentioned to you earlier, a young man who grew up in Bangladesh and actually was trying to develop a software product. And I mentioned this to Manny briefly. Labib, if you have a question, first of all, you were great in the movie last night.
Thank you.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, Manny, one of the things that you mentioned is the difficulty of tracking the information across your very large supply chain, of the inaccuracy of things when you show up, they work as you expected, and sometime later they don't, and this creates problems. How have you thought about using technology within PVH to ensure that you can accurately track all of that information possibly in real time?
Yeah, so this if you can imagine, go back 15, 20, it started, there was like these these manual sheets that were making goods in this factory. We couldn't even totally lay out corporate-wide where we were, where our production was everywhere around the world. So yes, someone in Van Heusen knew exactly where all the sportswear was being made, but then the dress shirt group was making it in some of the same factories in different, and we just to gather the information. So look, one of the things you have to do, I think, is you have to build a system with where those things are captured, and it's not once a year that you just accumulate. It just has to be there and ready. The other thing we found, it's not necessarily directly to your answer. It's better to be with less suppliers in a bigger way. And instead, one way to conduct business in our industry is be in every factory and chase the lowest price all the time and be opportunistic and go after it. And then you get what you deserve, both from a quality of product point of view and some of the ramifications of that. And what we've found is really trying to partner up front with less and keep tightening the supply chain. You get better costs by making more commitment to those factories. And by knowing that those factories are doing things the right way, you have more assurance that you're in control. And you could, if you represent 50% of somebody's production, and that represents 5% of your production, you could be sure almost every day somebody from PVH is in that factory, checking the lines, looking at quality, whatever, and it's less about checking the checklist. Is the electricity on, and is the right? You're there and you know that what's going on. You talk to the workers on the line. You know if there's really problems going on. It's having a presence in those places.
An alternative answer to B would be, you're a millennial, you're annoying us, just sit down. I thought yours was better. I did think yours was better, though. All right, do we have another question? No one's brave enough to ask a question? Nick Anderson over there.
Do I need a microphone or
Yeah, wow.
Let's give Nick a chair.
Earlier on, you mentioned the packaging issue, that the consumers didn't want to buy something even if it may have been environmentally superior because it didn't look better. I've seen a lot of that sort of thing in my work too, and I'm wondering if you see somewhere in the future where a consumer would demand something that's environmentally superior regardless of its appearance.
No, I mean, I don't have a lot of faith. I've seen too many things, so I think, let me caveat that. I think the consumer is demanding more and more, and what used to be a value-added proposition has now become just a requirement. So, you used to pat yourself, Timberland used to pat themselves on the back to say, what a great environmentally conscious company we are. We plant 1,000 trees a year or whatever it was, and we do these things. And it was fine. But I think those messages don't resonate anymore. That used to be the way things worked. So now it's more about, what does your company stand for? What do you do? And I've seen too many cases, we made in America. Everybody said, oh, we should make goods in America. Everybody, except that nobody wants to spend $2 more for a dress shirt or a knit shirt because it's made in America, and that's just the reality of the situation. So the industry in the early 90s had this big Bob Hope, but made in America, everybody and it just died. There was made in America at $22.50, and there was made in South Korea for $19.50. $19.50 sold out, and the $22.50 just sat there shirt. So I think the consumer wants value. The consumer wants to know that you're doing things right. And if you're not, I think you pay a price. I don't know that you get patted on the back and people say, I'll do more and I'll pay more for it. No, I don't think they'll pay more for it. But if all things being equal, I think the choice will be made to go with the brand that they favor. Making those connections with brands, it's about, to some degree, it used to be all about marketing, how many pages you had in Vogue or GQ. That was critical. Today, it's much more about connections, and it's much more about talking about your brands and having a social experience with your consumer and having that connection with your consumer and talking about why the brand is so great, but also why the company is so great, what the value of the brands. People want to be invested in where they're spending their money. Yes, ma'am.
You asked too many questions, Phil. We're here.
Good morning, Miki Noguchi, Franklin Street Policy Group. Manny, you touched on it a little bit when you mentioned going into places like Ethiopia or Kenya and establishing a presence there. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the internal discussions and calculus and criteria that you guys are looking at when you're moving into a market like that, where on the one hand, there's obviously like a business opportunity there, there's something lucrative, et cetera, but where the calculations are different, as you said, than if you were going into business in Nebraska, right? So if you can just talk about in some of those more challenging environments, what do those internal discussions sound like?
Sure. So let's talk about Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country that developed, and it developed the industry in all the wrong ways. And by that I mean it was totally driven by the economic benefit that would come from making goods in Bangladesh. Product is really cheap, no duty. The U.S. government really got behind it, but what was missing was there was no, on the back end, there was no partnership discussion up front. The government, the manufacturing sector within Bangladesh, the brands, the NGOs, unions, no one came together at the beginning and said, listen, let's build this, and let's build a supply chain that's not only efficient, effective, drives low cost, but also is sustainable. And so what did you have? And it's a test case, I think. What you had Bangladesh being the kind of country it is, really poor infrastructure, so there was no investment made in roads. When it rains in Bangladesh, it turns into a flood. Getting goods from factories to the port is a disaster. Your lead times are 60 days longer because you have to build in all that cushion into it. And all those pressures put on the business community, there was no thought to, how is this going to impact the work environment? And it was just crunch out goods constantly with overtime issues, factory safety issues. You build a factory, and most factories are like football fields. They're laid out across. In Bangladesh, everything is vertical. It's up. So you have a factory in a horizontal football field type factory, everybody just runs out the doors. It's, usually there's not a major issue. If you're in a tenement building 13 stories high in Bangladesh and there's a fire and the fire department shows up and the ladder only goes to the 3rd floor and there's a fire on the 7th floor, anybody above the 7th floor is going to lose their life. And that's what we saw constantly happen. The safety issues weren't there. Great codes of conduct and building codes, but nobody was enforcing them and going through it. So it came back to the brands to really put the pressure on the area in Bangladesh. So what you had is you had really cheap product in Bangladesh. Because of that, you'd really like to make more goods there. You couldn't do it because the logistics were horrible, so you couldn't put as much production as you'd like. And because of all these issues, you couldn't be as committed to the country as you'd like because the manufacturers weren't as committed. So that's the wrong way to do it. In Ethiopia, and we'll see how it all plays itself out. We're at the very early stages, and there's issues there as well. You go into these third world developing countries, it's not going to be, like you're in Cleveland. Everything needs to be built. But what you would hope to do is you build a sustainable vertical production cycle where the cotton could be grown very close to where the mill is, which is very close to where the factory is, instead of importing everything from China or the United States from cotton, converting it to fabric in some mill in Southeast Asia, and then shipping it to Africa. So by starting up front, having all the production partners in the industrial park committing to the same code of conduct, committing to the same minimum standard of pay for everyone, having it built that there'll be a water filtration system built into the industrial park that everyone has to use. There's a cost to all those things, but when you consider how how efficient the production would be, how cost-effective the production is going to be. It's a small incremental cost to pay to still get a huge benefit. And that's I think, the difference to doing it right and letting it just happen and building it with forethought up front to really put together a sustainable chain. Now, we'll see what happens in Ethiopia. They just declared a state of emergency because the government is taking land away from people. So there's always issues, and you also have to be strong enough as an organization to fight through those issues, to put pressure on the government, but also recognize it's not, as Elliot said, we're not looking for perfection, we're looking to move this forward, and that's what we're trying to do.
So we're unfortunately out of time. I want to point out that we talked about one issue with consumers, but PVH has done a great job of beginning the process of eliminating toxic substances from their manufacturing process, which they will complete by 2020, reducing energy use, reducing water use, all these metrics. Please go to pvh.com and look at their 2015 corporate responsibility report, which was done by the people over here that Manny had nothing to do with. And it's just a wonderful report on the state of their organization.